One of our guests tonight on News and Views is a gentleman who is going to share with us some pages of history that are not generally well known. Just a few days ago, there was a proclamation that was put out by the governor, Jerry Brown, and it basically talked about something that a lot of people who live in Glendale, California, and other parts of California who are of Armenian descent are very familiar with, but most of us are not. It has to do with the genocide of the Armenian people between 1915 and 1923, when they were under siege by the Turks, and apparently 1.5 million of them lost their lives. This gentleman here, Ed Khachadourian, is going to be talking to us tonight about that very subject, very painful, personal story about it, a tale, though, that is miraculous in its way, in that your parents and you and some other members of your family were saved. Unfortunately, many relatives had died back in Armenia during the time this terrible thing took place. So, Ed Khachadourian, thank you so much for being with us.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Your daughter Lydia raves about you, respects you very much, and told me that I have to talk to you. So,
well, she raves a lot. So.
Well, I do what she tells me. Now, tell us some of the backstory. I have some photos that I'm going to be showing during our talk. But you were born in America, in upstate New York. Parents had come from Armenia first to come here?
The parents actually were what you would call citizens of the Ottoman Empire. Today, we look at that as being modern Turkey. But the Ottoman Empire not only encompassed what we know of as modern Turkey, but it also encompassed part of the Balkans, countries that we know of today as Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, parts of Croatia, and also the Middle East, Syria, Iraq. These were all part of the Ottoman Empire. And what is left of that from the outcome of the First World War was basically what we know of as the modern state of Turkey. But at one time, and for many centuries, it was a huge, huge empire. And the dissolution of that empire had a lot to do with the beginnings of the First World War because of areas of interest between the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians, and they called that empire, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, because as it was dissolving, it was raising a lot of animosities, antagonisms between other countries. And so they were citizens of the Ottoman Empire, basically, not of what we know as the Turkish Republic. The Ottomans and the Turks, sometimes the term is used interchangeably.
Yes.
So,
when we talk about modern day, your homeland in the modern day, in Armenia, we're talking about the area that is near Mount Ararat, which is the fabled landing spot of Noah's Ark.
Noah's Ark, yes.
And this is in the vicinity of what modern?
Okay, Mount Ararat is the historic mountain for the Armenians. Ararat actually is part of eastern Turkey, Lake Van, Mount Ararat. But that area, if you looked at a map of northeastern Turkey, it's sort of the old historical lands of the Armenians, and the Armenian race goes back thousands and thousands of years, well before the Turks, some of the migrations from the east moving into these areas that were part of the old Greek Empire, but the Armenians go back many thousands of years, and they were caught up with a lot of the wars, the fightings that were going back and forth through this particular place in the world, and the Armenians were sort of satraps of the old Roman Empire. Their histories go back even to Roman times. and Armenian legions even being part of the Roman army. So it has a long, long history. It's also considered the first country that established Christianity, that Christ's disciples, Bartholomew, went in and converted the Armenian king to Christianity before Constantine and Rome accepted Christianity. But it has a very long, rich history. Armenia today, for probably what saved it after the First World War, was it became part of the Soviet Union. And so what we know of Armenia today is a very, very small country, a poor country, has no access to the sea. After the First War, there was hope that Armenia was going to become a very viable country, which is basically the northeastern part of Turkey. That didn't happen for many, many reasons, and for reasons that we could talk at great length about. This at the end of the First War. So there is still in Armenia, it's not a very prosperous country. Of course, like so much of the Soviet Union, it became an independent state after the Soviet Union imploded. And we visited there some years ago, and interesting place, but a place that's struggling really to, have some kind of viable future. So it's still there, not what it was, but it still has a history.
So when you visited there, this was the first time you had seen it.
This is the first time.
Okay.
But what we know of Armenia today is when we talk about the old Ottoman Empire and what we know as modern Turkey, there was a huge Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. And it was this population, Christians living amongst Muslims, that created a lot of the animosity that took place. The Ottomans were they were really a multicultural society, and Armenians, Greeks, all the other ethnic groups that were a part of this empire, they did well. Someone once said that if you called the Ottoman embassy in Paris, then chances were that it was an Armenian that picked up the phone because they did very well commercially. They owned a lot of businesses. They were really, really quite prosperous. But this is at a time when the Ottomans were, as I said, a multi-ethnic, multi-race empire, and so everyone was pretty much tolerated. The people, interestingly enough, the Ottomans had a program of taking young Christian boys from the Balkans, which they controlled during those years, bringing them into Constantinople and training them into government service. And over the years, several hundred years, they became very, very powerful in the Ottoman government. These were young Christian boys that converted to be Muslims, and then gave them very, very important occupations in the Ottoman army. So
why is it that it appears that there was a symbiotic relationship between the Turks and the Armenians right around 1900 or so, and then in 1915, all of a sudden, the genocide started?
Well, actually, the genocide started earlier.
Okay.
It did start earlier. There are in 1896 there was I think it might be something akin to similar to what the Jewish people maybe were suffering in Russia. There were these pogroms for these all of a sudden
race riots.
And things like
religious
this.
riots.
And this happened actually in the 19th century. It happened early in the 20th century, before the big upheaval that started during World War I. And Gerry, if you recall, the Ottomans were part of the were on the German and Austro-Hungarian side in that war.
Yeah.
The thing that started to change all this was the countries in the Balkans throwing off Ottoman rule. The Greeks, then the Romanians, the Bulgarians. There was a revolution in the Ottoman government around 1905 when a group called the Young Turks took power. And they were seeing these Christian countries, in spite of all this rule of the Ottomans over the years, these areas in the Balkans were still, a lot of the people were Muslim, but the majority were Christian. The Greeks never became a Muslim race. The Romanians, these people, they hung on to their Christianity. So the Turkish government saw that these Christian countries were starting to split off and throw out the Ottomans. And meanwhile, on the eastern side, you had Armenians who were also Christians. And I think there was something there that as they saw that their empire was crumbling, that they were concerned about, well, we're losing Europe, we're losing the Balkans, and now you've got this Armenian agitation also for some form of independence.
Yeah.
And we believe that this may have had now something to do with how much of this are we going to lose and what are we going to end up with. And I think that had a lot to do with it also.
Let me ask you this. What religion were the Armenian people way back before they became Christian?
I couldn't tell you that.
Greek Orthodox, perhaps?
No, before they became, well, the Orthodox are Christians. The Armenians are not really called Orthodox. There's a wonderful monastery called San Lazzaro in the lagoon of Venice that Armenian monks went in the 15th or 16th century, and they came to the Doge and asked him that they had come and they wanted to build a monastery. And there was this island that had been deserted that used to house leopards, and that's the San Lazzaro. And he said, I've got the perfect place for it. Nobody wanted to go. And so these old Armenian monks, these priests, built this monastery, and it's still there. It's a marvelous place to visit. The first time I visited, I was talking to my wife, and I referred to the Armenians as Orthodox. And this old priest was standing there. He was a wonderful man. We met him several times on our visit. And he looked at me and he said, no, not Orthodox, apostolic. Apostolic comes from the fact that the Armenians became Christians through the apostles coming and proselytizing Christianity, meaning it's not the Russian Orthodox, it's not the Greek Orthodox, we're Armenian apostolic because of Christ's disciples bringing Christianity to the Armenians, so they receive the religion directly from the apostles and not from others well after the life of Christ.
Okay.
And the Protestants, as our family was, the evolution into Protestantism for many Armenians came about because of American missionaries. Why would American missionaries, Christian missionaries, be coming into a country where the people were all basically Christian?
Yes.
Because they were evangelical Christians. They were not the apostolic, the Orthodox. They were the evangelical, the Bible Christians. And this was not an emphasis that the older Christian religions had. That was one reason that the Americans came. The other reason was disease was rampant back in those days. My father was he was the youngest son and the only survivor in that family because they were dying of things like smallpox, typhus. My mother, who hundreds of miles away in Smyrna on the Mediterranean coast, her oldest sister, who was a nurse, incidentally, died of tuberculosis. So you had a lot of orphans because of disease in these areas. It was pretty much all over the world, and that was another reason they came, to educate, to evangelize, to take care of orphans, and they established missionaries all throughout parts of Armenia. They didn't go into the Muslim countries, into the Muslim sections, but they came to the Christian sections, where they could teach the Bible and have a more receptive group. And that's how my dad and many other Armenians basically embraced Protestantism rather than the old apostolic faith.
Let's fast forward now, if we may, to the chapter in the book that your daughter gave to me, in which your parents were shown, and they suffered during this particular time that we're talking about in this time of history.
There was a concerted effort, and the Turks refused to use the word genocide. But as they were seeing that their empire was vanishing, they realized they had to hold something, and they had to build what they wanted, an all-Muslim or Turkish country. They had lost everything else. But here were these Armenians agitating that they wanted a piece of this empire, and it was a piece that they were not willing to give them. And the real brutality started during the war in 1915. And how do you get rid of a people? We know what happened during the Nazi period. Well, while they didn't do it in places like Constantinople and in Smyrna, large urban areas, commerce and all this, in the interiors, they started to rouse the Armenians out of their towns, out of their villages, and sent them out into the deserts, into Syria, into Iraq. And how do you get rid of people? Well, you can force them out of their villages and push them off into deserts where you hope that they'll all starve, die of disease, whatever. In my father's town of Hajian, and this was a practically all Armenian town, about 25,000 people. They, first of all, the young men were gone. They had all been conscripted into the Ottoman army. So there were no young men there. And so you had old people, you had women, you had children, and these people were uprooted, villages after villages, towns after towns, sent off into the desert, where literally thousands of them died of disease, died of starvation. These marauding bands would attack these columns of people. It was absolutely horrible. The fact is, by some miracle, my father, his wife, and 3 sons survived, and they ended up in a place which is quite ironic, called El Raqqa. El Raqqa today is the headquarters of ISIS.
Oh, boy.
And all I can say is, if there are any Christians because Christians were scattered all over this, if there are any Christians still in Raqqa when ISIS arrived, I don't even want to think of what's happened to them.
Right.
Then, 3 years later, with the war over, if you can believe this, people came back to Hajian. Not all of them. We think only a third of them came back. One of the reasons we think they came back was because so much of Turkey had become internationalized, and they thought that they were safe in coming back to their village. The story is very complicated. The European powers started to back off from a place like Hajin and Adana on the Mediterranean, where there was a big French military presence there. In 1920, these brigands and the Turkish army started to encroach on these villages that still contained Armenian people, and my father left Hajin, leaving his wife and 3 children there, came down to Adana and made contact with the French naval forces there, tried to get them to send French Marines up to relieve Hajin, and the French naval commander said, "I have no authority to send our French people up there." And while he was there in Adana, he found out that the Turks had come into the town and massacred practically all except a few hundred. And in the massacre was his wife and his 3 young boys. He was, of course, when they got the news, if he had stayed, if he hadn't gone to get help, he would have perished also.
Yes.
And he was, he was in total anguish. And the thing that gave him, I think, the will to live was that we think that he realized that there was a mission. You had all these orphans wandering around the city of Adana, and he basically, he and several others went and started rounding up all these orphans that were starving on the street, Armenians. I'm sure there were many young girls too, and brought all these boys into Adana, and there's the picture, and this is just a small percentage of these young people, and what these terrible times wrought for them. And he ran the orphanage for a while, and then finally made his way through Constantinople, which is a part of the story that I don't quite know how he did make it, but he went to Constantinople, which was still pretty much internationalized then. And the Turks, the father of Turkey, Ataturk, his name was Mustafa Kemal, who was given credit for stopping the British at Gallipoli. He was an excellent general. He knew what he wanted to do. It was going to be Turkey for the Turks, and he not only drove the Armenians out, but they also drove all of the huge population in Smyrna, a huge Greek population, drove them out when the city went up in flames, and that's basically how my mother left Smyrna, with just the clothes on her back. And again, thankfully, because she was in American school there, that's how the American Navy basically saved her, and she eventually made her way to the United States.
How'd they meet?
We think they met once in Smyrna, because my father's sister-in-law, his wife's sister, actually lived in Smyrna, and my wife was a student there. But they met at Oberlin College in Ohio, and he was quite a bit older than she was, and he was at the theological school. She was at the music school. She had a beautiful voice. She had an opera quality voice. She was going to have a singing career, and he met her there, and she had this musical career, and you didn't become a pastor's wife when you wanted a musical career. You became a pastor's wife.
Yeah.
He told her, he said, "Anita, we're the only 2 Armenians on this campus. God has willed this." And so that's where they met. That's where they married, and beginning of a wonderful story after all that tragedy.
I sent your daughter a copy of Governor Brown's proclamation regarding this, and my final question to you, fascinating story. and we're going to show the book, My Beloved Armenia. We'll put this in the program. When you see things like the proclamation and the fact that people are beginning to notice what happened to your people, are you glad that younger Armenians might be tempted to learn more about their past? You mentioned that there's a lot of reluctance sometimes by people who survived all this to talk about it with their kids. But now the world is giving this attention. And California has a very large Armenian population, which has settled in Southern California and Glendale, also in the Sacramento area here. Do you think the young people are beginning to get an interest back in their past?
It's very hard to say, Jerry. This country offers so many opportunities, and while the past is important, I think history is incredibly important, very important for us to understand the present today. America is an incredible country because we become culturalized to American society so easily here, and it's very easy to forget your parents, your grandparents' past. Armenians are scattered all over the world, like the Jewish people are. Will they maintain that, or will they try to remember that? It's very, very hard to say. The cultures that they live in today, they may accept them to the point that the old cultures that their old families come from, they may be lost. That would be a shame. It's hard to say. There's still in Armenia, when we went there, the children, the young people, because they were the ones that took us around, they had a lot of pride in their country, but it's a struggle for them. And they said, as long as there's an Armenia, then you'll have that relationship, just like, I guess, as long as there's an Israel. The young Jewish people have that relationship. But life is hard for them over there. One of the young ladies said, if we had a chance to leave, she said, I think we'd all leave. It's that difficult. So can we keep the flame alive? It's hard to say. I'm very pleased to say my grandsons, all 6 of them, all Khachadourian boys, were making a comeback. That they'll be important. I'm very happy that both my daughter and my son seem to be very, very interested, more so than I was interested when I was a youngster. So that's hopeful. It's a rich culture. It's a wonderful culture, and I hope years down the road that people will still know where they came from. Young Armenian people will know where they came from and what their roots were, because it is a culture. It's a history that should be cherished.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It was great talking to you, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting some history into place that a lot of people don't know about. We will be back in a minute. Stay with us.